Bonjour. Bien, mesdames et messieurs, bonsoir. Merci beaucoup de votre présence.
Good morning. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Thank you very much for your presence at the end of this European Council. We have just concluded discussions on several topics. I will tell you about them before answering your questions. First, this morning we mentioned the situation in Ukraine in the presence of President Zelensky. I was then able to meet with him on a bilateral basis, and we unanimously, at 26, reaffirmed our indispensable support for the independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Ukraine. The objective that we share, and we share it with the United States of America, is to put an end to the fight without delay. And in this regard, it must be clear that any negotiation on a ceasefire, a peace in Ukraine, must be held in the presence of Ukraine. That the Europeans must be associated as soon as the security of our continent is mentioned. And very clearly, I would have said here that our will to all is to have a robust and sustainable peace, as we have reaffirmed since the beginning. In this regard, the recent announcements of President Trump open our eyes in the right direction, which have made it possible to say very clearly the reality of the situation. That is to say, a Russia that does not truly want peace, and that has allowed to resynchronize the European and American agenda on the Ukrainian issue. We have all shared today also in our conclusions our will to pursue immediate and long-term financial support to Ukraine as being our priority. And we have therefore given a mandate to the Commission to work, in connection with our ministers and our treasurers, on the different technical modalities to finance this effort. You know that there were several proposals that had been made, with debates, and we will be able to come back to them if there are questions around the respect of international law, which we support, and the sharing of the risk on proposals that had been made by the Commission. The technical clarifications have not allowed today to complete this building. Nevertheless, the will was very clearly reaffirmed. A mandate was given to the Commission so that we can have a final agreement in December. And so, a significant envelope of this support for the 26-27 years to Ukraine will be dedicated to military support, with strict criteria related to European preference, and also in order to integrate more industrial bases of Ukrainian and European defense. Civil support will also have to be linked to the acceleration of reforms on the European path of Ukraine, to financial transparency, and to the consolidation of the state of law. At the same time that we have reaffirmed our desire to help Ukraine, we have also reiterated the need to exert maximum pressure on Russia through sanctions. And I congratulate myself on the adoption of the 19th package of sanctions, which will allow, among other things, to completely prohibit all transactions related to the Russian GNL, purchase, import, and transfer from January 1, 2027, and also to fight better against bypasses. And this package of sanctions, which has been working for several weeks, as you know, arrives at the same time as American sanctions, which have been confirmed in recent hours, and which hit the main exporters of Russian oil, and therefore sources of financing for the Russian war effort in an unprecedented way, with very strong decisions that have been taken and which activate the OFAC in this regard. This is for the Ukrainian question, and I will obviously come back to all the questions. I was able to meet, as I told you, with President Zelensky, and we will hold a meeting tomorrow afternoon of the Coalition of Volunteers, which we will co-chair with Prime Minister Starmer, and which will allow us to come back on the concrete efforts with our British and French chiefs of staff to make a point on the planning and progress, and also on the coordination of our actions to fight against the Phantom Fleet, which is, as you know, one of the sources of financing for the Russian war effort. The second international topic that we have mentioned is the situation in the Middle East. So we mentioned it this afternoon. It is reflected in our conclusions. We did it yesterday at the dinner with President Sisi, at the end of the summit he held with the President and the President. And I was able to meet for a long time last night with President Sisi, at the end of our exchange. We were able to highlight the role of Egypt in its role in the negotiations, obviously the summit of Sharm el-Sheikh, but in the end the subject is very clear in the matter. And our determination is whole to allow the implementation of the American peace plan and to take into account the priorities that are ours and which were expressed last July during the New York Declaration, adopted, I remind you, by 142 states, and in particular the entirety of the Arab states of the region. The priorities that are ours It is obviously the full respect of the ceasefire by all parties involved, and in particular Hamas, which has continued to carry out actions that are not in line with its commitments. It is the resumption of humanitarian aid, which today is not fully effective, with a maximum of 300 trucks per day, which is very far from the required needs, and so that all humanitarians can resume their work. It is then the establishment of a governance specific to Gaza, with the role of the Palestinians and the Palestinian Authority in this process that is fully recognized, the deployment of internal security forces and police forces that we are ready to train more, and the establishment of an international stabilization force mandated by the United Nations Security Council. As such, the European Union has an important role to play, and we have collectively expressed our availability in this regard, in particular with the deployment of the UBAM Rafah missions to secure the passage points of Rafah, as well as the reinforcement of our training missions with the Palestinian police, so that they can be quickly deployed in Gaza. In this context, we are working with our British partners and with all the partners in the region to finalize a resolution project, which is the essential framework that will allow us to structure these efforts and to pursue the implementation of the American peace plan. Here, too, I could go back to all the possible questions. I am necessarily lacunar in a summary. The third major topic that we mentioned at this summit is that of European defense. Europe is advancing in the construction of its strategic autonomy with concrete support for its defense industry to achieve the goal that we all pursue, which is by 2030 to fill our critical capacity gaps, in particular in the 9 priority areas identified in the Extraordinary European Council of March 6 last year and in the White Paper. Within the work coordinated by the European Defense Agency, we reiterated that we were ready to ensure the piloting as a framework nation with other member states when it is possible of capacity-building coalitions in several areas: air and anti-missile defense, artillery systems, ammunition and missiles, strategic facilitators, space, and there too, I am not exclusive. In each of these areas, we must demonstrate the added European value of the capacities under development in full coherence with NATO. And the flagship initiatives proposed will have to meet the needs of our armies and be adaptable to the evolution of threats. And in connection with the roadmap for European defense on the Horizon 2030, which we finalized a little over 3 years ago, we propose to mobilize, in particular on the strengthening of our capacities in terms of air and anti-missile defense, which the war in Ukraine showed the need for. To finance these initiatives, we can rely on the European instruments available now, the SAFE instrument, which we have finalized, and to which, moreover, France subscribes with several others, but also the so-called EDIP program, for which the agreement was found between the Council and the European Parliament, which is an important step forward. These instruments will allow to strengthen our industrial base, the European defense technologies, by organizing and dedicating, which has been, as you know, the subject of many discussions, a European preference which must apply to all our financing devices, including those of the BEI. And we strongly support this European preference, not so that it is an exclusivity, but because there are already many programs that allow to mobilize European funding or national funding for non-European capacities. But it is essential when we talk about innovation or capacities for our defense, if we want to fill our capacity deficits, to have this European preference. This is what has been correcting biases that have existed for too long in our organization. On this subject, finally, the governance will be ensured by the European Council, in accordance with the skills enshrined by our treaties for the monitoring of our capacity and industrial priorities, and on the basis of the work of the EU and the AED, the European Defense Agency, and our defense ministers. And so we are also dedicating a new culture between our defense ministers, which will be brought together in a much more regular way together to discuss these issues. On this, it is the result, as you know, of several months of work, but we have now built the instruments, the governance, and the axes to move forward. Now, the key is to animate these capacity coalitions, to mobilize the purchasing states, to give visibility to the industrialists, and to stimulate production so that we produce more and faster in Europe. Finally, we have a whole innovation which is also planned as part of the funding. And on this, I wish that it really rests on the technological capacities and that we assume to have a funding on the capacity needs which are ours in terms of innovation and by favoring projects and by abandoning our old habit of geographic return, which creates too much inefficiency. The other big topic of discussion of this council was competitiveness, with, as you know, discussions that have been carried out on the basis of the State Hydra reports for months, an agenda that we know now and which is perfectly scandalous. On competitiveness, I have spoken to you several times already. We have a subject of implementation. We know the different aspects of competitiveness, the simplification of many of our rules, and in this regard, the failure of the vote yesterday in Parliament to accelerate the process must be the object of a work resumed in a peaceful way and must be resubmitted in November. In any case, this is what we support because we must succeed in creating consensus on the need to simplify, to harmonize our rules, to resynchronize our Europe with the rest of the world. We also have an agenda of deepening the single market, to have a much more efficient Europe in all areas, from energy to telecommunications, through finance, and therefore simplification of our rules. In this regard, the 28th regime proposed by the Commission is obviously very important. We obviously have an agenda of innovation. We must assume to finance more breakup innovation, to go much faster and much stronger, and to finance them. It will have to be reflected in our budgetary priorities in the future, and in this regard, the Union of Capital Markets is obviously an essential project on which we have reaffirmed our desire to move forward. But there has been an acceleration of the world in recent months that is quite perceptible, and it comes from both sides. On the one hand, the United States of America is much more aggressive. Tariffs that are imposed on us, sectors that are also revisited, on which there is growing pressure, pharmacy or digital, and also a relationship and an evolution of the exchange between the euro and the dollar, which, in a way, doubles the effect of tariffs in real terms. And this weighs on our price competitiveness and on many sectors. Notwithstanding the fact that American tariffs have completely redirected flows from Southeast Asia or elsewhere on the European market, and also have indirect effects. And then the second thing is the acceleration of a trend that we have seen since the release of COVID. It is a Chinese economy that produces a lot, that has invested a lot, which is, in a logic, it must be said, of assumed dumping, which adjusts the imbalance that it has between its domestic market, its domestic production, by deploying volumes massively on many other economies, in particular ours, with massive destabilizations and, in addition to that, exchange effects. Faced with this, it reprioritizes what, several years ago, I had called at the AE the importance of economic security and the agenda of economic security. And this agenda, which is an agenda of protection, not of protectionism, but of protection, has become even more priority. That's why we supported, several months ago, the decision of the European Commission to protect, to restore fair competition for our electric vehicles. That's why we pushed a lot to take measures of safeguarding steel. The steel sector being a perfect example of an unequal competition of China, but also a lot of volumes coming from Southeast Asia which were redirected to the European market in this new context. But we want to go much further in this matter. And so, we are in favor of accelerating precisely our work on the revision of the mechanism of carbon adjustment at the border, which must become robust, non-convertible, preserve the competitiveness of our exports and our industries. That's why, beyond steel, we want to look in all sectors the need to move forward. And that's also why we asked that investigations could be opened to see how we defend ourselves in a coordinated way. And so, we need a European agenda much more united in this matter. We have instruments that we know, in particular, of anti-coercion. We need to open investigations to look at this and have a much more systematic approach in terms of economic security. And as such, we can see that we have practices of coercion coming from both sides. The recent Chinese decision on rare earths, which, by the way, since April last year, imposes licenses with many expectations from many industrialists. We have several thousand industrialists who have been waiting for their licenses since April. And today, a hardening of these rules in response to the US tariff, which means that now they can impose on any industrialist who produces by using more than 0.1% of rare earths from China. This mechanism is economic coercion. And so, in the face of this, we need to have an answer. We need to see the impact it has on us, and we need to be able to provide an answer. In the same way, all attempts to destabilize our regulatory autonomy on the digital, in all areas, are coercive practices to which we must be able to respond. And so, in this area we have a long discussion and we push a lot to strengthen this protection mechanism of our Europe, of our industrialists. And it is worth, in all areas, beyond what I have mentioned, a lot of our SMEs. Our SMEs in the industrial sectors are today shaken by Chinese products that arrive and are completely below profitability levels, which is the characteristic of dumping. We must therefore be able to protect them by quick and effective measures. And then, this is what we also see in all our countries, with what are called small packages. France deals with it in its future budgetary texts. And we have, with a few others, taken the first measures to impose taxes, but we have in France in 2024, there were 800 million small packages. At the scale of Europe, more than 4.5 billion small packages. These small packages are under the threshold of the de minimis. That is to say, still today, they are out of any tax, out of any regulation. And they come to compete your downtown businesses. And so, you see in many of our villages, of our small towns, these businesses have collapsed because we have more and more of our compatriots who buy directly. It is completely contrary to our decarbonation objectives. We bring things that we bought in the corner of the street at the end of the world. And it completely kills our commercial fabric and our European production fabric. And so, in the face of this, first, we have payment mechanisms that we will put in place in advance with several other European countries. But we need to put in place rates, obviously, much faster. And it is at the European scale that we must do it. And this is what I also asked for during this council. And then we also came back to compatibility, the articulation of our climate objectives, of our climate ambition with this context. And what we must continue to pursue, you have heard me several times here to remind you, is basically an objective of competitiveness, sovereignty, and respect for our commitments on climate change. And the three are reconcilable if we do them in a proportionate way and with the right articulation. So we had a long debate on the intermediate climate objective for 2040, which preserves our competitiveness and allows us to be on the trajectory of carbon neutrality in 2050. And so, in addition to the conditions on competitiveness, we have reached an agreement on the elements to take into account in the revision of the climate law for 2040. First, recognize the uncertainties related to the capacity of absorption of natural and technological carbon wells with a revision clause in 2030. Why? Because I don't want to be too technical, but between the objective of raw and net reduction, carbon wells play a very important role. And it turns out that the figures we had until then have degraded a lot. Our forests absorb less carbon than before, and this is a scientific observation that has been established. So we must be able to take this evolution into account when we talk about a net objective. Second thing is to review the sharing of the effort to reduce emissions between member states by following a principle cost efficiency for competitiveness. Third point is the possibility, as provided by the Paris Agreement, to resort to flexibility, in particular high-quality international carbon credits up to 5%. And finally, to ensure respect for technological neutrality with regard to all low-carbon, nuclear, and renewable energies. These criteria allow us to have a French strategy that is totally compatible with the objectives for 2040 that we have at the European level. And with the elements that I just told you are compatible with our competitiveness objectives. This is also what allowed us to articulate a common position on strategic sectors such as the automotive sector, which are at the heart of our strategic ambitions. We share a desire to defend our objectives, but to defend our European competitiveness with a greening obligation of business fleets, which creates a supply shock in the matter. To introduce in the regulation of CO2 emissions, reduction a minimum European value rate, and a list of local critical components, European preferences, European content, but also to reintroduce flexibility to achieve the 2035 objective, which puts in our texts that we decided in French and German at the end of last August, which is this technological neutrality to which we believe. These works will obviously continue in the Council, both on the revision of the climate law and in view of the COP of Balaam. so that the European Union can present its ambition to reduce emissions in its expected contribution. Finally, the very last point that was mentioned in this council on which I want to return, and which is related to the digital subject that I mentioned too quickly, is the protection of online minors. We have begun to build a coalition of partners, and with Greece, Spain, Cyprus, Slovenia, Denmark, we have set our will to the Commission to advance nationally on an age beyond which minors will no longer be able to access social networks. With the directive that we took, our Act on Digital Services, it is possible to force platforms to check the age of users, and we are advancing on technical solutions to do so. And we will try to make everyone converge towards a digital majority at the European level to better protect our children. It is a work that we have prepared for several months. We have this first coalition. Our goal in the coming weeks will be to bring together as many European partners as possible to implement this decision. That's it, ladies and gentlemen.